Chief Justice Marshall's argument in Marbury v. Madison convincingly shows that the courts may interpret the Constitution. It does not prove that the courts are the sole or the final authority on the Constitution, however. The obvious question after Marbury is, what if the court takes one position on a constitutional issue, but a different branch disagrees? Chief Justice Marshall's reasoning is convincing, assuming the Supreme Court is alone in a vacuum, but nothing in his proof shows that the other branches can't also interpret the Constitution, or that they would be any worse at it than the courts. In fact, a similar proof might be made to show that Congress can also repeal unconstitutional laws, or that the president should refuse to execute laws he deems unconstitutional. Now, at times, the court has made statements that it is the highest authority on the Constitution. In Cooper v. Aaron, during the Civil Rights Movement, the court wrote, "The federal judiciary is supreme in the exposition of the law of the Constitution." Notice how this is a stronger claim than in Marbury. Marbury only proves that the court can interpret the Constitution, not that it is supreme in doing so. Of course, the word supreme in the Supreme Court's title only means that they are higher than other courts, not that they are supreme over the other branches. That said, public opinion today does seem to treat the judiciary as if it were the supreme and final arbiter on constitutional questions. An important alternative to judicial supremacy is a theory called departmentalism. Let's return to Thomas Jefferson, whom we last met as an opponent of Marbury v. Madison. Jefferson believed each of the three departments has equally the right to decide for itself what is its duty under the Constitution. This is the definition of departmentalism. The legislature, executive, and judiciary all have equal authority to determine what the Constitution means. Jefferson points out the need for checks on the courts, stating that if we had judicial supremacy, the Constitution would be a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. Another president who believed in departmentalism was Andrew Jackson. Recall that Jackson was convinced that the national bank was unconstitutional. Even though the Supreme Court had recently upheld the national bank in McCulloch v. Maryland, President Jackson believed he could come to his own decision, and he vetoed the bank's charter. In his bank veto message, Jackson wrote, "The Congress, the executive, and the court must each for itself be guided by its own opinion of the Constitution. The opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges, and the President is independent of both. The authority of the Supreme Court should have only such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve." As Jackson points out, a court that writes with persuasive reasoning may convince other politicians, or might influence the voters. On this theory, what the judges can do depends on the persuasive power of their words. The flip side, of course, is that if the court writes an opinion that is notably unconvincing or wrong-headed, the other branches may come to a different conclusion. And few rulings have ever been less persuasive than Dred Scott. After Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court did not strike down another act of Congress for decades. I say an act of Congress purposefully, for again, they did strike down state laws. Unlike Marbury, which struck down the relatively minor Section 13, Dred Scott knocked out one of the pillars of stability in the Union, the Missouri Compromise, which divided territories between slave and free. "No," said the court, "all federal territories are now home to slavery. Keep in mind you could still have a free state, but all territory that was not part of a state now must allow slavery." Just for good measure, the court added that black Americans, even those who were free, could never be citizens. Besides its obvious racism, this decision is seen as a major step towards civil war. It is beyond doubt the worst decision in the history of the court. The question, for leaders like President Lincoln, was how to respond to the Dred Scott ruling. Lincoln, again, followed a form of departmentalism. Lincoln believed he was bound to follow the court's ruling with respect to the specific parties involved, But one individual case did not set a precedent that would bind the other branches. If the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott himself was a slave, then, indeed, he was a slave. But that didn't mean the decision was controlling for other people in other cases. In an 1857 speech, Lincoln said, "If a matter had been before the court more than once, and had there been affirmed and reaffirmed through a course of years, it might be a precedent. But Dred Scott alone was not settled doctrine for the country." Later, in his first inaugural address, Lincoln again argued for departmentalism, saying, "If the policy of the government is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, in ordinary litigation between parties, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers." As a president, Lincoln practiced what he preached. For example, Lincoln issued passports and patents to African Americans, even though they should have been non-citizens if he followed the Dred Scott ruling. This takes us to a fundamental point. The problem with judicial review in a democracy is that lawmakers are elected, while judges are unelected. Therefore, judicial decisions that strike down a popularly enacted law are counter-majoritarian. At the federal level, the judges serve life terms, making them unaccountable to public opinion. Not only are those judges unaccountable, the people who serve on the court are, to quote Justice Scalia, strikingly unrepresentative of the citizen body. In 2015, when the court recognized a nationwide right to same-sex marriage in Obergefell v. Hodges, using substantive due process, Justice Scalia pointed out in dissent that the entire court comprised successful lawyers who studied at Harvard or Yale. 8 of them grew up in East and West Coast states. Not a single evangelical Christian, a group that comprises about 1/4 of Americans, or even a Protestant of any denomination. How can 9 elite lawyers in a marble hall have the just authority to make sweeping social change, such as redefining marriage? Despite these criticisms, there is a seeming paradox. Although the court is unrepresentative, it consistently enjoys higher approval ratings than the other branches. In April 2023, 48% of Americans approved of the court, while just 26% approved of Congress. As a rule of thumb, the court's approval is usually around double that of Congress. Not only do Americans rate the court more highly, they also seem to believe it is the final authority on constitutional questions. 71% of Americans agreed that when there is a conflict over the meaning of the U.S. Constitution, the Supreme Court has the last say. Departmentalists, like Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln, would surely disagree. Why do Americans trust this unrepresentative, unaccountable institution? Research by political scientists Hibbing and Tice Morse offers 2 answers. First, the court shows less of its internal conflicts in public. Quote, "Congressional debates and compromises are frequently conducted in full view. Disagreements are often public and vocal. On the other hand, debates and compromises among the justices are not exposed to the public. Disagreements are private or contained in written scholarly prose." Second, the justices are seen as non-self-interested. Again to quote, "Their decisions are not perceived to affect their own material well-being. Even in controversial decisions like Bush versus Gore, which decided the 2020 election, the public may not have liked what the court did and may have realized that the court is political, but most people were not led to conclude that the justices' actions were designed to make themselves rich." Of course, this second rationale implies that corruption scandals involving a justice would make a serious dent in the court's popularity and legitimacy. In short, American politics treats the court as having the final say on constitutional issues, not because that is the system the founders created, but rather because the court has high trust among the people. The effectiveness of judicial review depends on the court's public image. Even a deeply unpopular Congress still has power of the purse. The executive still has power of the sword, but the judiciary is different. Its very power depends on its public standing. History shows that when the court delegitimizes itself, for example, after Dred Scott or during the Lochner era, it can become vulnerable to attacks, and departmentalist theories start gaining steam. So perhaps Andrew Jackson really was right when he wrote, "The authority of the Supreme Court should have only such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve."